It's the third Sunday of Advent, the Sunday of joy. So naturally, we're considering the story of a king of Judah whom God struck with leprosy for insubordination in the temple. What could possibly say joy more than that? Lots of things, of course. Coffee crisp, finding a toonie in the wash, passing through airport security. I'm sure you've thought of a dozen other things already. The story of King Uzziah is not a joyful story. I very well could be the only pastor in the world preaching on 2 Chronicles chapter 26 today. So why would I do that? Well, we're doing Christmas outside the lines here at Kingsway, and Uzziah certainly takes us way outside the lines of Advent as we normally understand Advent. But there are specific reasons, too, that I hope will become clear as we go along. Truth be told, Uzziah isn't a biblical figure who features in many sermons any time of the year. Not just this time of year. When his name is said aloud in church, it's usually from the death notice found in Isaiah chapter 6, verse 1. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne high and lofty, and the hem of his robe filled the temple. The story of Isaiah's call has inspired generations of Christian pastors, missionaries, activists, and all manner of other serious disciples, eager to respond as Isaiah did, "Here am I, Lord. Send me." So that's the context. That's what readily comes to mind when we think of Uzziah, if anything at all comes to mind. Isaiah the prophet had a powerful vision in the temple the year that Uzziah the king kicked the bucket. In the church's collective memory, therefore, Uzziah is really little more than a prologue and a backdrop for another more famous biblical figure. Two more famous biblical figures, in fact, Isaiah and Jesus. Uzziah is one of the ancestors of Jesus whom Matthew lists in the opening chapter of his gospel. And bringing prologue and backdrop type stories like Uzziah's more front and center, even for just 1 week, is a big part of what doing Christmas outside the lines is all about. Uzziah lies outside the lines of the gospel story as we normally tell it. Yet, in another sense, Uzziah is a very inside the lines kind of figure in the history of God's people. He was, after all, a king, and it's hard to get more insider than that. Uzziah was a person of power and privilege who reigned in Judah for 52 years. Not quite as long as Queen Elizabeth II, but a long time. More than half a century. More than a few people in Judah would have lived and died and known no other king besides Uzziah. From the time that Uzziah was 16, power and privilege was all he knew. And much of Uzziah's long reign was, in fact, according to 2 Chronicles, defined by economic prosperity, military glory, and faithfulness to God. He was a good king, but a king whose success eventually went to his head and led him astray. He got too accustomed to his power and his privilege. When he had become strong, he grew proud to his destruction, the chronicler bluntly states. Pride so often does lead to our destruction. Pride isn't just one of the 7 deadly sins. Some of the church fathers rightly classify it as the taproot sin that feeds all the others. Pride produces a kind of amnesia that causes us to forget our humanity, our creatureliness. And so in his pride, Uzziah forgot that even kings, especially the kings of God's people, have boundaries and limitations. One day, Uzziah wanted to make an offering on the altar in the temple, and he decided to do it himself. He wanted to do it himself for God. But he forgot that only priests were anointed to approach and make offerings at the altar in the temple. And the priests reminded him of this. They tried to stop him, but when they reminded him of their role, he became angry with them. How dare you tell me that I, the king, cannot do something? How dare you tell me that I, the king, cannot enter into the sanctuary of the Lord? In his anger, Uzziah grabs the incense away from the priests, and in that moment he becomes leprous. It starts on his forehead and spreads, and it persists for the rest of his life. A life he is forced to live from that point on in seclusion and quarantine. The leprosy renders him unclean, so he can no longer enter any part of the temple, much less the sanctuary. The leprosy renders him unable to fulfill his public duties as the king, as he must be confined to a separate house, away from the palace and the court, to avoid infecting other people he comes in contact with. Uzziah's son, Jotham, takes over as acting king. So in the year Uzziah died, this would have been the lonely and pitiful state in which he was found. It's not a joyful story, but it's one I think we need to be more acquainted with in order to help us understand the radical meaning and importance of Christmas, what God is accomplishing through the coming of Jesus in Bethlehem. Isaiah, whose unclean lips are made clean with a glowing coal in the hands of a seraph in the year that the leprous king Uzziah dies, Isaiah is the great prophet of Christmas. We cannot tell the Christmas story. We cannot explain the Christmas story without borrowing some of Isaiah's words. Our choir demonstrated that last week when they presented this year's Christmas cantata, a cantata filled with the words of Isaiah. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel, God with us. Uzziah's connection to Isaiah is one reason why I chose to highlight his story this Advent. I also chose him to represent the many kings who populate much of Jesus' family tree. Some of those kings were good. Some of them were bad. Uzziah was a bit of both. And in that way, he not only represents all the kings of Judah, he represents all of us as well. All of us who are also fearfully and wonderfully made. All of us who are both gifted and flawed. All of us who are both insiders and outsiders in some way, in some context. All of us who are both bound and free. We are bound because we are human beings. We are mortals. And boundaries, defined roles, not only distinguish kings from tyrants, they distinguish creatures from the Creator. No matter how successful or powerful or rich we may become, we cannot forget where we stand before and in relation to God. There's a bit of the drama of Eden in Uzziah's story. And that's another thing that we share in common with this lonely and pitiful king. We're all children of God. We are also, too, all children of Adam and Eve, who don't like boundaries, who don't like to settle for simply being creatures, who don't like to be told we can't, even if it's just one thing. And our continued resistance to God along these lines binds us and holds us back. But we're also a people who are free. And we are people who are free because Christ has set us free. We are no longer dependent on our righteousness, but on His. We are no longer dependent on our love and grace, but on His. And that's why loving Christ, serving Christ, offering our lives to Christ in His name and for His sake is not a burden, but a great privilege. Because it's not done. It can never be done out of obligation, but really, truly only out of imitation and ingratitude for Christ and for all Christ has done and continues to do for us. Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, He continues the ministry of Isaiah and the other prophets. He continues to call out the folly and the vanity of the privileged and the powerful and the prideful wherever we are to be found. But He also announces a different, alternate ending to lonely, sinful, unjoyful stories like Uzziah's. And that's why the gospel, why Christmas is good news. Jesus doesn't banish lepers. Jesus touches and heals lepers. Jesus gives sight to the blind and sets the captives free. Jesus tears the veil in the sanctuary of the temple clean in two. Because of Jesus, we can, in fact, worship God and offer our sacrifices directly. And because of Jesus, we can love as God first loves us. Because of Jesus, we can do all things through Him who strengthens us. So there is some joy to be found here after all, if not in Uzziah's story itself, in its wake. Because Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, is indeed coming to Bethlehem this Christmas. And so may we all continue on this journey to go to Bethlehem with the shepherds and to see where Jesus, Emmanuel, lies, so that we might all come to say, along with the prophet Isaiah, "Here I am, Lord. Send me," not out of obligation, but with joy and in gratitude for the good news of this season. Thanks be to God. Amen.